I'd like to begin with a quick thanks to all of you that have watched my last video. It's easily the best received theory I've made yet, some even going as far as to say that I solved Deltarune. However, I want to make it clear that I most certainly did not. There is one fatal flaw that completely invalidates my last theory, that this theory will be rectifying. Not that you need to have seen the last theory in order to understand this one. Long story short, I made the claim that Deltarune is real, and I'm not backing down from that point. It's just that I may have made a few misguided assumptions concerning reality and what it means to be real. You see, I made the incorrect assumption that fiction is created by determination. While the concepts that this conclusion allowed me to explore were certainly profound and insightful, it was nonetheless incorrect. Now, before I get into that, if you aren't familiar with my last theory, or just general Deltarune knowledge for that matter, you may be confused how I came to a conclusion regarding fiction as a whole from the analysis of just a single game. Well, it's because Deltarune's narrative surrounds the interaction of two different worlds, the light and dark worlds, as a sort of metaphor for fiction. You see, dark worlds are these fantastical adventures not only to us the player, but also to Lightners as well, who without them live relatively mundane lives in the light world, without, and I quote, axes and battles and magic, where everything can be healed with a little spell. Basic RPG mechanics that these RPG characters are explicitly living in a world without. Rather intriguing if you ask me. Anyways, just know as I analyze the workings of the light and dark worlds, it isn't simply an analysis of Deltarune, but rather an exploration of how Deltarune believes all fiction functions as a whole. So, in this theory's effort to gain a greater understanding of Deltarune, it is in turn going to be building a general model for how all fiction functions, meaning that it will sort of be going back and forth in scope from the two. This outlining naturally implies a baseline model that Deltarune believes is present in all fiction. A model that you will see it has made clear to be centered around one thing: determination. Going back to repairing my last theory, to get into the specifics, my former mistake stemmed from me misinterpreting the fact that dark worlds are only able to be experienced by Lightners through using determination to create a dark fountain. You likely already see where I made my mistake. Determination does not create dark worlds, it creates dark fountains. I know that may seem glaringly obvious now, but believe me when I say that it's hard to distinguish between creating and experiencing in this context. Dark worlds can only be experienced when a dark fountain is created, so you can really only know a dark world exists if you create a dark fountain with determination. Hence why I made the false connection. We only really know dark worlds aren't created along with their fountains because of evidence that they exist before them. Many Darkners have genuine backstories that involve other characters and actual locations in their respective dark worlds, so clearly their existence is in no way artificial. As we can see, determination has nothing to do with the very existence of dark worlds, and by extension, the existence of fictional worlds. This aligns with the fact that the worlds of most pieces of fiction don't just cease to exist outside of your interaction with them. Before and after most conventional stories, there is still a fictional world that exists despite not being directly experienced. So, what does determination even do? Well, as we've established, determination is what is used to create dark fountains, not dark worlds. So then, what is the purpose of a dark fountain? Sure, we know that they are what allow Lightners to experience dark worlds, but what exactly does determination have to do with that? If you've watched my last theory, you already know that in classic Toby Fox fashion, determination is a very loaded term. Essentially, it is the power to determine. This definition fit well when it was applied to creating, which in a deterministic sense is synonymous with determining, but it doesn't ring well when being simply what allows you to experience fiction. But that's how Deltarune uses it nonetheless, so clearly we have some investigating ahead of us. So in this video, I will show how determination is indeed the power that allows you to experience fiction, rather than create it. To start, we must understand what it even means to experience fiction. What this is essentially asking is what separates Lancer from a Jack of Spades, in the way that one is a genuine person living through the experience of fiction, and the other is just an inanimate object. To give a few examples on how this relates to fiction as a whole, think about this. The most moving book you've ever read is told through the same black text a soulless corporation uses to read you their privacy policy. The most profound movie you've ever seen is told through the same two-dimensional screen that orients you at a miserable job. And, of course, the most life-changing game you've ever played, the greatest creative and artistic experience you've ever had, is written in the same lines of code as a generative AI, taking that same art and creativity and regurgitating it as some meaningless mess. Maybe I got a bit too specific there. Anyways, what I'm getting at here is that the determination of a dark fountain that turns a jack of spades into Lancer is the same means that turns a computer program into Deltarune. Pretty clear cut, right? This tells us that these experiences you've had with fiction do not give the impression of truly being alive because of the medium they are told through, as the same means of creation can be used for something far more lifeless. There is something deeper about fiction than merely technical fidelity. There is some genuine semblance of life that fiction creates from its lifeless medium. This act of creating a lively world from a lifeless medium is what I will call immersion, and it is created by determination. Now that we understand what exactly immersion is, we can begin to explore how it is created through determination. Pulling back the scope to Deltarune, a good place to start is to try and find any side effects of a dark fountain's determination on dark worlds. And while for the most part, they don't seem to alter dark worlds in any major way, there is one compelling detail. If you've studied the backstories of Darkners like Spampton, Jevil, or Queen as of Chapter 2, you'll notice that they appear to have actually interacted with other Darkners outside of their own dark world. This detail becomes rather confusing when you compare it to the fact that Darkners can only exist in their own dark world, and will be turned to stone, effectively reverting them back to their inanimate and lifeless state, if they were to not fit the will of the one they have traveled to. An important aspect of this condition is that this enforcement of will is the result of a dark fountain. In fact, this phenomenon is directly connected to the determination of a dark fountain, as to belong in a dark world is to, quote, reflect the will of its fountain. Will, of course, being synonymous to determination as referenced by Queen. All this paints a rather clear picture on what Deltarune is trying to say about immersion, and its relationship with determination, at least on the surface level. Determination creates immersion through enforcing a central concept that everything in a piece of fiction is connected to. Everything in Card Kingdom can be tied back to cards and similar board games, just as everything in Cyberworld can be tied back to computers. If an average Darkner were to not reflect this single identity, they will simply not be granted life. A simpler way to describe this is theme, which for the time being I will define as a central idea that everything in a piece of fiction is derived from. This concept of theme is present in all fiction. No matter how abstract or absurd a piece of fiction may be, the mere fact that it is being delivered to you as fiction is meaning on its own, as fiction is created by people, and people naturally have intention. They require that intention to make fiction. And that intention, whether being explicitly written into a narrative, a script you've been rewriting for the past 4 months, or just a general vibe you take away from it, is present nonetheless, as it is ultimately the central idea that everything in that piece of fiction is derived from. Though, ironically, if you've experienced fiction before, you'll know that its theme is not immediately evident, usually only becoming truly realized at its very ending. This is why the phrase roll credits is used whenever a story outright says its title. The statement of a story's central idea is generally associated with a story's ending. This may at first seem completely contradictory to theme's central and determining nature, but there's a reason for this. Think of a theme off the top of your head. You likely thought of something like, if at first you don't succeed, try again, or friendship overcomes all. While these are indeed themes when applied, on their own they are nothing but statements. This is because they lack difference. Difference being simply the presence of multiple statements that are distinctly different from each other. A better way to describe these statements are as absolutes, which are essentially anything that is self-contained and singular within context. A good example for this dynamic of theme being created from the difference of absolutes is painting. Imagine trying to make a painting that can only be a single color, only to realize all you can make is a featureless backdrop, no more complex than the canvas you started with. What it is missing fundamentally is difference. The actual content of a painting can only be achieved if there is more than a singular absolute of color. Pretty straightforward, right? Theme functions in the exact same way. The statement of a piece of fiction that a story communicates to the observer must be contrasted with a differing absolute in order to have a theme. This is what is called conflict, and it is a fundamental component to storytelling. For example, the statement of Undertale's pacifist route is essentially in the name, pacifism, and the contrast is also rather straightforward, violence. Though, ironically, Undertale begins with the latter. In this world, it is either kill or be killed, is the first statement you are ever told outside of the tutorial. In fact, almost every major character would kill you, intentionally or unintentionally if you let them. The state Undertale begins in is hardly pacifistic, but that is exactly the point that there is a living world to begin with. If Undertale was trying to communicate a statement of pacifism through simply portraying a world that is stagnantly pacifistic, needless to say, there would be no semblance of life. It would be the same as if you were to just put in plain text, "This is the pacifist route," and then rolled credits. That is to say, you would have nothing but a blank canvas of solid color, a lifeless medium. That is not to say theme is essentially turn right to go left, as a story ultimately ends with the statement it is trying to communicate. What the difference of theme more accurately does is give room for its statement to be grown into. This is because, as we know, a statement without this difference lacks complexity and content. So the immersion that theme creates is ultimately the process of approaching a singular statement and not the singular statement itself. Like the saying goes, meaning is not found in the destination, but the journey. Now, you may be wondering where Deltarune falls in this mechanic, seeing that, as we've established, the theme of Dark Worlds are nothing but singular statements. Card Kingdom and Cyber World. Roll credits. But now that we understand how the determination of a theme is applied to fiction, we can now explore how Deltarune uses this mechanic and flips it on its head. When going on an adventure in a dark world, you don't at first see the Dark Fountain. In fact, Deltarune goes out of its way to deliberately conceal the fountain, even in early places it would make sense to see it in. This is because the very appearance of a dark fountain symbolizes the confrontation with the Dark World's theme, as it is what determines and enforces this world's singular statement. As you get closer to the fountain, and it starts appearing more often, you are in turn getting closer to realizing the theme. This all comes to a head when you finally reach the Dark Fountain to seal it, and oddly, this act of sealing isn't some elaborate task. It's merely confronting it, directly, without obstruction. And as you do so, everything fades out into a screen of solid white, until you are left with inanimate objects, the lifeless medium of this lively world. For a while, I was scratching my head trying to apply the difference of theme to Dark Worlds, as while the lifeless objects that make up their worlds parallel the meaningless statement of an unapplied theme, they seemed to be completely void of difference. Cyberworld is always undeniably cyber-themed, and Card Kingdom is always undeniably themed after cards in similar board games. Luckily, I eventually realized that this is a result of how Dark Worlds represent their themes. As we've earlier established, the very appearance of a Dark Fountain is symbolic of confronting theme. This is because Dark Fountains are the literal physical manifestations of a Dark World's theme. This metatextual element is taking up literal space in the world it is determining, which is why the realization is not a matter of the metatextual distance from this theme statement being closed, but rather simply the literal distance from the theme statement being closed. Rather fascinatingly, theme in Dark Worlds is represented as a physical dimension. The literal distance from the physical manifestation of theme is the difference that gives it its meaning. Quite literally, meaning is not the destination, but the journey. Once this distance is closed, and the fountain is confronted without physical obstruction, something like a boss fight standing in your way, the Dark World's theme is realized, and you're left with the lifeless medium that made up this lively world. What this unique usage of theme shows us is that theme is a more fundamental concept than simply a literary element, which makes sense when you keep in mind that theme is created by determination, since the ability to determine is applicable to far more than just determining the resolution that a story will build into. Rather, the determination that creates immersion can be seen as ultimately just the act of taking difference and changing it into a single determined state. With that in mind, I'd like to ask the question, what does Deltarune mean? Like the name. If Undertale was about a tale that took place underground, surely its anagram successor, Deltarune, the quote, parallel story to Undertale, would carry its own meaning as well. Sure, the root words delta and rune are a lot more vague than the terms under and tail, but it isn't unlike Toby Fox to make names with ridiculously complex sources. For example, Toriel is named after Tutorial because she gave you a tutorial in Undertale. Then, Toriel and Asgore's names add up to Asriel's name. As of Asgore and Riel of Toriel create Asriel, and then Asriel is an anagram of Ralsei. And finally, Ralsei gives you a tutorial in Deltarune. Boom, full circle. The point I'm making is that you'd be underestimating Toby to assume that the name of his magnum opus would be completely meaningless. There is, without a doubt, some deeper meaning that can be extracted from it. So back to the question, what does delta and rune mean? I'll start with rune as its meaning is a bit more explicit. Rune is defined as some kind of archaic text, most specifically used to describe a letter in the ancient Germanic alphabet. This can most safely be tied to the prophecy told in the beginning of Deltarune, a likely ancient text that has been foretold by time and space itself. Which would make sense as Deltarune is the name of the prophecy in Deltarune. So rune in Deltarune means prophecy. Moving on to delta, it unfortunately does not technically have an official definition, as it is simply the fourth letter in the Greek alphabet, but it does hold a common meaning in mathematics, where it is essentially used to represent the change between two different values. For any KSP nerds, you likely know delta V means change in velocity. Before you question me using mathematical representations to define delta, remember that it is genuinely the only commonly accepted meaning delta is tied to. So delta, in Deltarune, essentially means a change in difference. Now, when we put both these meanings together, we get the ChangeProphecy. See what I did with the title? If we were to have come to this meaning before all of that earlier context, this would have made completely zero sense. But luckily, now we know exactly what this means by a change in difference. So now we can finally start applying all this analysis of determination and its relationship to immersion to Deltarune as a whole. Though quickly before that, making these videos is a great passion of mine, and I can assure you that there are more coming in the future. So if you've enjoyed this video so far, it would be a big help to me if you were to consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's get back to the theory. Deltarune begins with a legend. The legend of Deltarune. In this legend, it outlines that the world of Deltarune exists through the balance of light and dark, and that if this balance were to be destroyed, there would be a cataclysmic event where, quote, the earth will draw her final breath. It then goes on to end by mentioning that this balance is beginning to change toward encroaching darkness. So, what we have here is a fictional world existing through the difference of two absolutes, where that difference is being destroyed through one absolute growing stronger than the other. Now, I first want to point out how this fits our model of theme perfectly, as it's the change in balance of conflicting absolutes toward one singular absolute. But beyond that, similar to Dark Worlds, the whole world of Deltarune uses theme rather unconventionally. Thematic determination in Deltarune is not only concerned with the immersion of its experiencer, like all pieces of fiction, but also concerned with the very existence of that fictional world itself. The prophecy states very clearly that if this thematic determination is to be realized, and darkness is to completely consume light, not only us the player will be met with a canvas of solid color, so to speak, but the world of Deltarune itself would come to an end as well. It will die along with our immersion of it. The term used to describe this concept of metatextual elements existing both in and outside of a piece of fiction is diegetic. A great example of diegesis is how in Undertale, saving and loading was a mechanic present not only in its gameplay, but also at the core of its story. What this tells us is that the player's immersion in Deltarune is a concept that exists inside of Deltarune's world, which perfectly lines up with the fact that in both the beginning of Deltarune and its announcement on Twitter, you are met with an ominous voice asking you directly if you are connected to Deltarune's world. Connection in this context is of course synonymous to immersion, as it is used to describe the act of having the game open and in turn experiencing its fiction. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what I mean by an ominous voice. This voice, as you may already know, is none other than W.D. Gaster, the mystery man and abusive partner of every theorist's relationship to Deltarune. Why we know it is him is essentially because it is consistent with his distinct speech pattern, and the music that plays in this area is heavily derived from his theme, among other more implicit context. Why this is important is because Gaster is a very mysterious character. It's implied that he's behind a lot, but we still don't know truly why. This mysteriousness leads many similarly mysterious happenings in both Deltarune and Undertale to be tied back to him. Though, unfortunately, there are very few pieces of concrete evidence that we have to build an actual idea of Gaster's character and motivations. Him being behind the player's connection to Deltarune is one of 3 relevant actions that can most clearly be tied back to him. The second being his seeming discovery of darkness in Entry 17, where he essentially just keeps talking about how dark it is, like supernaturally dark, literally negative light, which goes well with his third action being the creation of the legend that prophesies darkness overcoming light, which was first ever told through time and space, a phrase related to Gaster's untimely fate in Wingdings, the font exclusively used by W.D. Gaster, the W.D. in his name standing for Wingdings. So, the same person that connected the player to Deltarune also created the legend prophesizing the change in balance of darkness overpowering light, and is also the person to seemingly discover darkness to begin with. All this being considered, it makes perfect sense that the player's connection to Deltarune happens at the exact same time the Car Kingdom Dark Fountain is opened, as we know from the legend. Using determination, theme is created through the change in balance of light and dark toward singular darkness, and that change is creating the immersion that connects us the player to the fictional world of Deltarune. Now, I'm sure that left you with at least one glaring question. Am I saying that Gaster is the knight? No. Beyond the fact that he's probably not in any condition to be opening fountains himself, this theory is only concerned with the fact that in order for Gaster to have control over the player's connection, he must also have some sense of control on the creation of more darkness, in order to create the thematic determination that immerses the player. That being said, yes, this theory is saying that Gaster is at the very least influencing whoever you believe to be the knight to create more darkness, which is supported by the fact that Gaster says he has been waiting the same as we have been for the connection, implying that he isn't the one directly taking the actions needed to create it. This is the primary claim of this theory in regards to Deltarune, that Gaster created our connection to its fictional world through prophesizing the change in difference of light and dark, a task that is carried out, ultimately through determination. The foundation to this argument being that a change in difference through determination is what fundamentally creates immersion in fiction, giving life to what would alternatively be nothing but a lifeless medium. However, I understand that this conclusion is built off of a, while in my opinion well supported, admittedly quite elaborate line of reasoning. Despite there being a relatively clear path to this conclusion, I see that it still feels as though there is something missing. To get to exactly what this missing piece is, I'd like to present you with a question. Have you ever wondered why Toby Fox didn't just make Undertale 2? I mean, Undertale 1, in this respect, was so successful. Why didn't he simply continue right where that success left off, instead of creating an entirely, mostly, unique new game? Well, it's because of a fact that is inescapable in fiction. Finality. There was no Undertale 2 because Undertale was complete. Its story was finished, and it had reached an end state. In the FAQ on Deltarune.com, Toby addresses concerns about Deltarune being some kind of sequel to Undertale. It reads, "Please don't worry too much about that. Essentially, this is not the world of Undertale. If you've completed Undertale, the ending and world are as you left it. If everyone was happy there, the people in the Undertale world will still be happy. So please don't worry about those characters, and that world. It will remain untouched." To rephrase that, Deltarune's world is a different one, with different characters that have lived different lives. A whole new story will happen. When I first read this, it made me think about what it must feel like to be one of Undertale's characters at this point in their time. Imagine you're a monster in the pacifist route. When time began, humans and monsters emerged. A war broke out between them, and the human victors sealed monster kind away underground. Then, multiple generations later, a human fell down and freed all of monster kind. A world-changing shift from imprisonment to freedom. The future has never been brighter. And then, finally, history just ends. I mean, they lived happily ever after, of course. Happily ever after. Such a line is commonplace in a fiction's ending. It's a statement that, despite the ending to our immersion in fiction, the world of that fiction continues on beyond our experience of it, in this final state. But why does this mark the end to our immersion in fiction anyways? Well, it's because such a state is impossible to truly experience. Try to imagine what it must feel like to live happily ever after the events of Undertale. And I'm not talking about the post-credit scenes, nor the alarm clock dialogue. I'm talking about what it must feel like to be those characters in the Undertale world that will still be happy. Forever. Happily forever after. Such a concept is impossible to truly experience for the same reason it is impossible to grasp infinity. There is no difference, no change, nothing to be determined. It is a canvas of solid color. There was no Undertale 2 because of the exact thing Toby is concerned with in this quote. There being a continuation to Undertale would put the forever happiness, or more precisely, tranquility of its world at stake. Because in order for there to be a continuation in our immersion in fiction, its world must keep changing in order to keep it from slipping into the forever, the singularly infinite, and ultimately intangible. This is exactly what I've been trying to get at with this model of immersion, theme, and ultimately determination. The reason our ability to experience fiction is so inseparably tied to determination is because determination is something fundamental to the very essence of experience. With this absence of change and determination, fiction becomes undefined, undetermined, happily ever after, and we are in turn plucked out of its world to be met with a lifeless medium. And that's because of exactly what immersion is. In the beginning of this video, I defined immersion as the creation of a living world from a lifeless medium. While this definition has been enough to get us to this point, it lacks one important detail, that being, what does it even mean for a world to be alive? Luckily, I've already somewhat answered this in my last video, where I drew parallels between the determination of fiction to the determination of reality, establishing that reflecting reality essentially is the key to this question. And it makes sense. Naturally, in order to make a living world, you must reflect the traits of the living world, our reality, our universe. This whole video, we've been trying to answer what can pretty well be defined as the metaphysics of fiction, as we try to identify the underlying mechanics that communicate the life of a self-contained fictional world beyond its threshold into reality. How else could this be achieved other than reflecting the underlying mechanics that give life to reality? or more accurately, give life to the universe. Now, I like to preface the following statements I'm about to make with the fact that I am not a physicist, nor a cosmologist, so I ask you to bear with me with what I'm about to say. The creation of the universe, as we most confidently know it, was more accurately the creation of difference. From a singular point, a singularity, a blank canvas of solid color, if you will, the entire universe expanded out into this random, chaotic, and ultimately differentiated mess. From this difference, and nothing but this difference, the galaxies, stars, planets, and ultimately us were created. However, this expansion that gave life to the universe, which I quickly want to mention at this point in time is called dark energy, never stopped. It is currently accelerating at an exponential rate. Where exactly this expansion is taking us is not entirely certain, but it can be safely assumed to have something to do with entropy. All you need to know about entropy for the sake of this discussion is that it seeks what is called equilibrium, which is essentially a state where everything is equal. Of course, logically, when everything is equal, there is only one singular state that everything holds equally. We are brought back to a state of singularity. So, life, as we most fundamentally know it, is the change in difference, the existence of the entire universe. Everything is derived from this difference, and that difference was created only from the perpetual expansion of the universe. And this perpetual expansion of the universe, the direction of literally all things, is ultimately toward singularity, thematic determination. That is why this concept of existing beyond the singularity as a fictional character after their story is complete is so incomprehensible, because it is as if you were to continue to exist beyond the literal end of everything. Fiction exists without change, whilst change is something that is inherent to reality, and by extension, our very experience as beings of reality. So, in order for us to experience fiction, it must have change applied to it. But in fiction, change is always finite, as a story cannot simply write itself forever. That is what separates reality from fiction. And that is also what makes Deltarune so special. Its characters will not exist beyond its singularity. Deltarune's world will die if we reach the end of its difference, the balance of light and dark. So as we continue to be immersed in its fiction, as we continue to be connected to its world will continue to change toward the singularity of darkness. Our mere presence is inadvertently driving Deltarune closer and closer to destruction. But don't worry, this was all part of Gaster's plan, the ChangeProphecy, remember? You see, there's a part of this prophecy that I left out. It outlines a contingency of what will happen if the balance between light and dark is destroyed. The Delta Warriors, Chris, Susie, and Ralsei, the party you command, hold the sole power to seal the dark fountains and banish the angels' heaven, restoring the balance of light and dark, and as a result, saving the world. This is written rather confusingly, so let's unpack this one by one. It makes sense that in order to restore balance, we must seal the dark fountains to stop darkness from overcoming light. But what the hell is the Angel's Heaven? This is the only place in the entire game it is currently ever mentioned. What is the angel and the heaven that is to be banished? Well, it has something to do with the consequence of restoring balance. As we've already established, the very change of this balance in effort to achieve a singular state of darkness is what is creating our connection to Deltarune. So if we are to put an end to this change, our connection will be severed. In other words, we will be banished from Deltarune's world. We are the Angel of Deltarune. We descend upon its world through it reflecting the heavens we come from, the thematic determination of reality. However, this determination will slowly destroy this world over time, so inevitably, whether we sever our connection preemptively in order to save it, or persist stubbornly until it destroys itself, we will reach that same singular end, the end to our connection. Tragically unfortunate, yes, but is there not something more important than reaching the end? That is my current standing theory of Deltarune. And the reason I say current standing is because of a problem I'll admit I've been having with writing theories. I understand that with every coming video I release, I make new conclusions about Deltarune, usually completely overwriting my former ones, and this video is no different. I get that no amount of shoehorning my ideas into some Toby Fox quote at the end of my video will fix the looming issues that my theories have had. However, as I've been writing this one, something has felt genuinely different. As I dug deeper and deeper into this theory, it started becoming eerily familiar. To put this all into perspective, this theory outlines that one entity inherently has determination, whilst another has very limited determination. As if it were to unnaturally gain an excess of it trying to match the first entity, it will end up destroying itself in the process. This may remind you of something. That's because it mirrors the exact dynamic between humans and monsters in Undertale. In Undertale, determination holds a different meaning, but in light of this theory, its purpose is the same. Humans have much greater determination than monsters, as monsters simply cannot hold as much, and will end up destroying themselves if they are to gain too much of it in an attempt to match a human's, transforming them into an amalgamate in their attempt to cheat death, a jumbled mass of excess determination that, while continues beyond death, does so in a way that will never truly be its former self, just as a sequel to fiction. Sure, with enough determination, our immersion, and consequently fiction's life will continue, but not in a way that will ever truly replicate its initial life. The life of both fiction and monsters is fantastical, yet finite. It's important that we cherish them while they live, lest their end leaves us unsatisfied, leading us to turn them into unrecognizable abominations in our very attempt at continuing the recognizable and familiar. Perhaps it's for the best that Deltarune will be destroyed if we ever push it this far. Why this is such an important connection to make is because of a piece of evidence that I believe is greatly underutilized in this theorizing community. Sure, we may not have the ending to Deltarune, nor anything close, but we do have the ending to Undertale, which Toby Fox has described as being made from a scrapped attempt at achieving Deltarune. What this implies is that there is some underlying parallel that can be drawn between Deltarune and Undertale, a reflection of a core idea, as they were both derived from the same goal to achieve that idea, that ending to a game in Toby's dream. This parallel is something I've actually been trying to find since my first ever theory on this channel, for an obvious reason. To find the point where these games overlap in their deepest of values is to find the ending Toby Fox had dreamt of all those years ago. It is to find the ending to Deltarune. So the fact that this theory has created an interpretation of determination, the most alluring concept present in both Deltarune and Undertale, that truly reflects both, is something that I believe may be subtly indicating that, after all the mistakes and false assumptions of my former attempts, this time I may actually be correct. So, I guess that's everything. Clearly you guys liked it when I tried something different last time, so I hope this video was a good continuation of that. As long as it didn't go completely off the deep end, especially with that last bit. I genuinely can't tell if any of it was remotely legible. If you couldn't understand it, that's a failure on my part. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'd appreciate anything you may have to say. But regardless of how it's received, I'm at the very least satisfied to have finally put these thoughts into words. And if those words are at least a little understandable, I'll call it a success. If you could get anything from this, it's that I've been thinking about this a lot, for a long time. You know, fiction is always a closed loop. With enough fixation, you'll eventually just start bouncing off its walls in a futile search for more change. And, as a wise Nikola Tesla Sona once said, that change will eventually become destructive. I promise you that the 6 months this has taken was in some way needed to truly achieve this final product. Not to say that every day was a perfectly productive one. Believe me, there were some major hurdles I had to get through. But I think that struggle resulted in an overall positive impact on how this all came out. And of course, among those hurdles are the other obligations I have in my life. In fact, if you're watching this on the day this goes live, I'm currently graduating high school, funnily enough. I honestly can't tell which one I feel more accomplished by. Like, obviously high school's important, moving on to college and all, but, like, it's not as unique as going out of my way to work on a big project like this. Either way, completing both in the same day is pretty nice. Also because I could get this video out before Deltarune's new chapters. Like, seriously, before the release date was announced, I was greatly stressed that I couldn't finish this in time, especially because I've been actively learning DaVinci Resolve while making this video. A weird part about doing stuff like this is that you start almost wishing that Deltarune doesn't get released so you can complete your own stuff in time. Like, when I finished my last video, I had zero hope I could finish another one before the new chapters. Yet, here we are. And with that, I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for watching the entirety of this video. It would be a great help to me if you were to consider subscribing to the channel. There are certainly more videos coming in the future, hopefully with shorter wait times than this one. I also have a Discord that I'm active on if you'd like to discuss theories and stuff. But anyways, I guess all that's now left to do is wait for Deltarune tomorrow. I'll see you all then.